obviously he didn't let that control him, but we still have temperaments and things like that. But Paul is one of the most important people in the New Testament. Obviously, aside from Jesus himself, Paul is maybe the second most important, if we want to say it that way. Really the author of most of what we have. I mean, responsible for the spread of the gospel, really more so than anybody that we have direct record of. He is an extremely important person, regardless of how we feel about him or not. So, as you're going through this, hopefully you've looked ahead at the packet and we're working on it a little bit. Was there anything new to you, or do we get the sense of how important Paul's transformation was? Was there anything that surprised you, or that you found interesting, maybe that you hadn't thought of before? We're not awake today, are we? Great.
So, in thinking about Paul and transformation, I was thinking for his change of view, his change of conclusion as to what he had witnessed and what he was doing. I think what was interesting about Paul to me was he was the same guy. Yeah. He was the same personality. He was the same, and I reported him in my notes as a zealot. He was the same zealot before his seeing Christ in person as after. He really didn't change himself. He just responded as the same person he was to new information in a way consistent with his character.
Yeah, it was redirected. Maybe it wasn't even redirected, because in a lot of ways it was the same direction he was going. He was zealous for the God of Israel. Now he's seeing the fulfillment of that. But yeah, he takes it from one way to another, but he's still just as passionate as he was before, and he was the person that gave him his all to everything, and we see that. So we've been going through these facts, and so we talked about the fact that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified under the Roman Empire, that his followers sincerely believed that they saw him alive again after he was executed. And now we're going to talk specifically about Paul and the change that happened in him. Because his change, going from persecuting the gospel to then being one of the biggest supporters ever of the way of Jesus, is really important in and of itself, and raises a lot of questions as to the way of Jesus. And so we're going to talk about this and why this is so certain, why everyone agrees that yes, this actually happened in Paul. And there is a lot of questions that raises about, okay, so what caused this change? And we're talking about that, and I know you all understand what happened. So this comes from, again, walking through 1 Corinthians 15. I'll get you in just a second, Joy. Walking through 1 Corinthians 15, and he lists all of the resurrection appearances. And so let's turn over here for a second, because we'll talk about that. He lists all the resurrection appearances, and then we have as the last one in verse 8, he says, he appeared also to me. And then he goes into a little bit of his background. So this is where we're pulling it from, is Paul's own testimony and what we're going to examine today. Yes, Miss Joy, what did you have?
Well, one of the things that I picked up about Paul was that even though his stance seemed to drastically change, he still remained honest, and he didn't try to justify what he'd done in the past.
Right.
He was honest.
Yeah, he said, I was doing what I thought was right, and I was just ignorant of it. Right. But he was the same passionate, devoted person. And so, looking just sort of at this opening paragraph, we said that the apostles' belief in Jesus' resurrection and then the transformation that happened in them as a result of that belief is some of the strongest evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and the reality that he was than alive and empowering people. And so what they did as a result of that conviction changed the world forever. Like we said, whether the message of Christianity is true or not, what they did changed the course of history forever. In a lot of ways, it built a lot of Western society, and in some ways, it's building society in the rest of the world currently. And Paul is a prime example of that. So this Jew who's born and he's educated as a Pharisee and all those things, then takes this message into Europe and turns Europe upside down, essentially, and ends up going all the way to the top. And history tells us that he even went before the emperor before his death, the leader of the known world, with this message. And so he changed everything in what he was doing for Christ. And so I say here, their testimony of what they had seen and heard was a primary way in which the Spirit worked to convince people of the truth. And that transformation that happened in Paul is one of the biggest ones. And that's part of what Paul says in some of these letters of, God used me as the weakest and the worst to show just how amazing his power actually is. And so that's part of what we're talking about. And none are more well known for this than the Apostle Saul of Tarsus. And so to understand that, obviously we have to look at who he was before and then who he was after to get this change. And so here in 1 Corinthians 15, and in verse 8 it lists, the last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And then in verse 9 he says, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. And so here there's one thing. I used to persecute the church of God. He appeared to me, and here I am. And then in verse 10, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. And so he talks about this change that happened in him, and that it was God's grace that caused this transformation. And so we want to talk about who he was before. So in discussing this, we have a lot of different areas that talk about this. We know that Paul wasn't indifferent about the message of Jesus. He didn't look at it and say, well, I could take it or leave it. It's just not really all that convincing to me. He wasn't sympathetic to it either. He was completely opposed and thought that he had to do everything in his power to destroy it and to punish everyone who was following it. And that was how strongly he felt. He was an enemy of this movement. And we're given description of those activities in these different areas, which I note. So, under who had Paul been before, number 1, describe in your own words who Paul was and what he was doing in his former life. So let's take a minute to talk about that. So what do you say as who Paul was and what he was doing in his former life? He was a persecutor of Christians. That's a huge one. Right? He spent a lot of his time trying to persecute Christians. What else? What did we say? Mr. Pettigrew.
Yeah. John recorded, if you hate your brother, you're murdered. I wonder, would it be possible, would Paul be guilty of some hatred when he treated them as disciples?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's maybe some indication, too, that he went even further than that and, physically harmed people. And so we'll talk about that as well. Yes. What else did we say? Who was Paul and what was he doing? I see somebody right here. Ashley.
He was a Jew and he was highly educated, even advancing beyond his teachers.
Yeah. So he was training to be a rabbi under the Pharisees. So in a lot of ways, he went to seminary, basically one of the ways that we would say it today. Paul was a seminary educated man. In some ways, I've heard people liken it to he was training to be part of the Supreme Court. And at that point, he was like the assistant to a Supreme Court justice. And that was kind of the prestige that they saw at the time. So yeah, he was training to be a rabbi. He was a rabbi. We got Andrew. Did somebody have their hand? John and then David.
Well, yeah, he was kind of going to be sort of a superhero in regard because he believed that Christianity was actually at fault against what should be happening, you know, the Jewish tradition. But anyway, he saw it as a group that was trying to thwart God's plan.
Absolutely.
So he became wanted to be like a superhero for God, really, and he thought he was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And of course, we trapped him for the persecution because he did way too far, very cruel person. His behavior and methods. He was violent. He thought he was actually doing the right thing for God.
That's the thing too. Yeah, he was fully convinced, and he says in places that we'll look at, I was fully convinced that this is what God wanted me to do, even though I was wrong. I really thought this is what God wanted me to do. Andrew.
As a Pharisee, we know from their sort of political temperament that the Pharisees, they hated the Greek influence, they hated the way Judaism had changed, and they were sort of reformationists of, you know, it's our job to get Judaism back to what it needs to be. And so you can frame it in modern terms of Paul was a staunch conservative in his ideology and in his mentality when it came to even the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
And that points to a tendency of that mindset is being very resistant to change and very hard to have one's mind changed.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of the words that he uses. I was raised according to the strictest sect of our religion, the Pharisees. And that was who they were. And yeah, he was, I'm sure, very resistant to any kind of those changes. What else do we say? Who was Paul and what was he doing in his former life? Great.
One thing Paul was not, was he was not a vigilante. He was not acting on his own initiative, but he was seeking legitimacy and support from others in the work that he was doing for God. I think that points to what Andrew just said about his conservative nature. He was operating within the framework of authority when he sought support in letters to imprison Christians. Paul was a rule follower, is another way to put that. I've had personality profiles that I meet, and they say you're a very strong rule follower. You want to know what the rules are, and you want to stay within the boundary of the rules. You want to do the things the way they're supposed to be done. And I think Paul was of that nature.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because we have that about Paul and then people think that he just went absolutely nuts and went off the rails, right? They talk about all of your learning has driven you crazy. And he's standing in front of these people who used to be his colleagues and his friends. And I can't wonder what they think. But with what you're saying, Greg, I always wonder, was Paul commissioned by, the council of the priests to do this? Did he take it upon himself and say, hey, I want to do this? Yeah, it's really interesting to think about all of this. Anything else that we want to add? Yeah, kind of summing this up. Paul he was a rabbi. He was working his way up the ladder. He was trained in the law, like we said, to be sort of like a Supreme Court justice eventually. And he thought that it was God's will for him to stamp out this blasphemy that was happening as part of Judaism. Because that's how Christianity was viewed at first. If you look through Acts, they talk about it as being part of Judaism, but the sect of the Nazarenes is a way. Early in history, they sort of referred to it as the Jesus movement as part of Judaism. And so he saw this as a distortion of God's revelation and something that he, as someone devoted to that had the responsibility to take care of. And so he goes all the way with that. And we'll talk about this in maybe a little bit more detail, but he pursues anyone that he got indication of that was confessing this Jesus. And so he was going to the synagogues, which at this time Christians would still worship in the synagogues. And he was taking them and arresting them. And he makes it clear that they would bind them up in the synagogues and they would do torture, essentially, to get them to denounce Jesus and to repent and turn back to the God of Israel. And then he'd take them and throw them in prison in Jerusalem, and all kinds of things happened. But it was very zealous, I think, as people said, and it was calculated, and it was aggressive. You know, he thought that he had to do everything in his power to completely get rid of this.
I think it's interesting that he was, it said that he was zealous toward God.
Yeah.
So he actually believed in God, but
Yeah, absolutely.
in the wrong way.
There was never a question in his mind of whether the God of Israel was the true God. He just was completely misguided on what that God wanted him to do, is what he says later. Andrew.
And I tend to agree that Paul showed a measure of violence himself, and it goes beyond, I think, just adhering to the rules, because we see in Acts 8 that he went beyond arresting at synagogues. He broke into people's homes. He went out and actively pursued and hunted people. So his methods were, I mean, I don't know all the how rights and laws really all work necessarily in that culture, but he seemed to go beyond just the confines of keeping this as a purifying of the synagogue.
Well, that would go back also to comparing this to what does the law say. And I mean the Mosaic law, in terms of if someone was a blasphemer against the God of Israel, they were liable to stone. I mean, that was clear cut. And so, you know, pursuing those people and giving them the chance to repent of that and denounce what they had done, or else you will pay the penalty of the law. I mean, that is very harsh, is the word that comes to mind, but it was what they thought God wanted them to do, right? Right.
I thought of it as references in the Old Covenant to God said you take the land, but he didn't hand it to them. They still had to fight for it. But beyond that, there was a strong duty to purify the land.
Yeah.
It was to be, you were to have all falsehood eliminated from the territory in which you possessed. From that standpoint, I think Paul was reflecting back on those, if you want to say, the golden era of Judaism, when they went after not just the leadership of foreign kings and so on, but individuals. They purged them from the land, and God always had this strong message of the purity of the land. And I think that was Paul's mindset when he said, it's not enough just to get it out of the synagogues, but we've got to get it out of
Israel.
Judea. Yeah, and Israel's heart. And so it was that goal that Israel hardly ever maintained, if ever, even as they occupied the land. They did not remove the foreign influence of the land. I think Paul was removing the foreign influence of the land in his mind.
Yeah. Can't do it with the Romans, but I could sure stomp out this heresy. And that's what Paul thought this was. He thought it was a heresy. Andrew, did you have your hand up again?
Oh, I was just going to say too that maybe that's what Paul wanted. If Paul had his way, every single Christian would be stoned. The fact that he had to arrest or imprison probably also speaks to there was a limit on their political power. And I don't recall whether or not it was frowned upon by the Romans, whether they frowned upon the Jews conducting stonings or executions on their own. I mean, obviously they stoned Stephen, so when they thought they could get away with it, they did. But they didn't stone Jesus. They tried to go through more official means when it came to his execution. So Saul probably felt hampered by politics when he wanted to just get things done his own way.
Yeah. And there's questions about, when were they abiding by the rules of their overlords and when they weren't. But yeah, Paul hunted down the Christians. He had them arrested, and then he also supported their executions. He's in full support of that. So we talked about this extremely devout Jewish man who made it his mission to get rid of this Jewish heresy, and he was given authority from the highest Jewish leadership to hunt down the heretics, to arrest them, to interrogate them, and then ultimately, if necessary, to put them forward for execution, which he supported. So how do we know all this? How can we be so sure that this actually happened? Answer is on the pages in front of you, but I want you to state it in your own words. How do we know that all this is true? That this is who Paul was? Grace.
Because Paul said so.
Yeah, he says it himself, for one thing. So how do we know? Number one, we said he said it himself, and then two, others are saying the same thing about him. So we'll look at this here starting at the bottom of page 1. So how do we know that the person that we know as the most famous preacher in church history, responsible for the spread of the gospel message into all parts of the known world at that point, and then the writer of most of what we have in the New Testament, how do we know he hadn't always been that way? Well, he said it himself first. So we're going to spend some time looking at this. So Paul speaks every so often about his former life and what he was doing. And if you compare what he says compared to what Acts says, he does not go into nearly as much detail. I think probably because of the guilt and the pain that would be associated with thinking about those kinds of things. But Paul speaks of his former life, and in multiple places through the writings that, again, we said that everybody would agree that are from Paul. He confesses that he had tried to persecute and destroy this movement, the Church of Jesus, with all of his power. And so we looked here at 1 Corinthians 15. And let's turn to Galatians chapter 1. This is another example of this. So Galatians chapter 1, and again, we're looking at what Paul says in his own words first. So Galatians is another one that everybody would agree, yeah, this is absolutely written by that guy, Paul. So in chapter 1, as we've looked at multiple times, again, he's talking about the fact that the gospel that he preached to the Galatians, he received from Christ. He wasn't taught it by anyone. And then, can someone read for us verses 13 and 14 of Galatians 1? Galatians 1, 13 and 14. Addie.
For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers.
Okay, thank you, Addie. Let's summarize. What does Paul say about his former life in Judaism here? What are a couple things that he says? You heard of my former life in Judaism. What?
He was trying to destroy the movement of Jesus.
Yeah, he was trying to destroy the Jesus movement. I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. Do you have your hand up, Jim?
Yeah, I was thinking, before Paul was converted, he was a lot like Satan, wasn't he?
It's an interesting connection there. Yeah, I mean, they were about sort of the same business in a lot of ways. So. What else did he say here in Galatians 1, 13, 14? Wasn't just trying to destroy this, but in verse 14.
He admits it as an avenue for advancement, and he wants to rise in the ranks, and he says in his own words, I was excelling more than anyone else.
Right. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of, my contemporaries, my classmates, all of that. And I was so extremely zealous. Do you think verse 14, is that like a braggadocious thing? Would Paul have said that if it wasn't true? Got some smirks, but what do we think? Is he just bragging on himself, or is this true? Taylor?
I'm thinking I wouldn't brag about something so negative.
Right, yeah. And again, too, part of the people in the church were those that were associated with him before. Other people knew of him, and if this wasn't true, they'd say, "What are you talking about? Paul was never part of this." And if he was just the guy that got everybody coffee. He wasn't that important. But he was a key important person in all of this. He was advancing in Judaism. He was very learned. And he says, "I was so extremely zealous." And it's interesting that he doesn't say for, the will of God or anything. He says for the tradition of my fathers. So something really important that we need to think about here with looking at Paul's life. Can we be absolutely convinced of what we think God's will for us is, but be absolutely wrong? Yes, we can be completely convinced that we understand the truth and what God wants, but be completely mistaken. And one of the foremost apostles was guilty of that. Andrew.
I think Paul's statement shows the unlikelihood of his conversion because he's essentially saying, Judaism was working for me.
Yeah.
Judaism was treating me really well, and I was achieving my goals, and I was being satisfied in what my motivations were by my path in Judaism and persecuting Christianity. And so, to that question of can we be so convinced and so dedicated and so zealous and still be wrong, is a matter of motivations. Paul's motivations were to achieve something, to make himself into something, to be somebody. And so his methods helped to satisfy his motivations. So in his mind, he felt like, yeah, this is working out. I'm getting what I want out of this. And so, our motivations need to be not self-motivated, but rather, a selfless motivation of, well, I could always be wrong. So how do I listen to somebody differently if I believe I could always be wrong? Or how do I read something and evaluate it differently if I think, I could always be wrong? And Paul never thought he could be wrong.
Right. I think the missing element and what's key to all that is humility, right? Again, this is what we believe and what we're talking about is not because of how smart we are. It's not because we've figured something out that nobody else has, but we have been given a gift. And there's not any inherent pride in ourselves about that. And we can learn that lesson from Paul. Okay, do we want to add anything about Galatians 1 before we move to the next one? Anything that you see here? Chip?
I was going to say, I feel like if God could have used Paul to spread Judaism to the world with his Roman citizenship and all that, and it would have been a big change and have many nations maybe joining Judaism, but he chose Christ right before that. So, it's obvious he didn't want to go that route. If God wanted to go that route, he would have had Paul be able to be the perfect catalyst for that. But
Yeah, a lot of those statements, I think in Galatians 2 are interesting because it says, God set me apart for a purpose before I was even born. He knew exactly who I was going to be and what he was going to try to do with me. And two, if you look closely at what Jesus says to Paul on the road to Damascus, and maybe we'll look at this later, it's hard for you to kick against the goads, things like that. God had been working on Paul's heart, and he was resisting it. He had been prodding him, and I don't know if maybe that was doubts or questions or something, but he indicates that he had been working on Paul and sort of pushing him, and he was resisting it. And then finally, he's confronted with the risen Jesus. And once you're confronted with reality like that, either I'm going to accept this or I'm going to go the opposite way. And with Paul's heart, confronted with that, he chooses the truth. That's a side note, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Let's go to Philippians chapter 3. This is another famous one here. Brace has got his hand up? Yeah.
I'm just going to say it's a little ironic, which God tends to do things like that.
Yeah.
It's a little ironic that one of the most Jewish people in the first century becomes the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right, yeah.
So it's, obviously we could speculate as to what the reasons are, but we have no idea. Jesus had his reasons for choosing Paul to be the apostle to the Gentiles, not the apostle to the Jews. But here's one of the most Jewish people in the first century, and Jesus says, you're going to go to the Gentiles.
Yeah, I think about that sometimes too. I think maybe part of it is his learning, because obviously he was familiar with a lot of Gentile thinkers and things like that. But it is just, yeah, one of the prominent, rising through the ranks rabbis. Okay, you're going to go talk to the Greeks and the pagans. And I'm sure as he was growing up and sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, he thought that's exactly where he was going to be. Was, off in Ephesus somewhere, arguing with, the temple of Artemis and all those things. So Philippians chapter 3. So again, this is Paul talking about, as he says in verse 2, look out for the dogs, those evildoers who mutilate the flesh, talking probably about, circumcision and things going on. Can we get somebody to read Philippians chapter 3, chapter 3, verses 3 through 6. Philippians 3 through 6. Chip.
For we are the circumcision who worship God in the Spirit, rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. Though I also might have confidence in the flesh, if someone else thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, I'm more so, circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, the Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless.
Okay, thank you, Chip. So you notice how Paul lays this out. Obviously, in verse 3, he's making the distinction between the false circumcision and the true circumcision, which is in Christ. And the point was that those who cause you to go with circumcision, then they can boast in your flesh and, be proud of those who are following them. He says, if anybody has any reason to be confident in any of the flesh, it's me. And look at how he lays this out in verse 5 and 6, where he's like climbing the ladder, and he makes it better and better and better and better. And so we start with circumcised on the 8th day, which, even proselytes to Judaism could be circumcised and then included in the Commonwealth of Israel, right? The strangers that would come into the nation, they would be circumcised and then considered part of Israel. Not just that, I was of the people of Israel. And I wasn't just part of Israel, I was part of Benjamin. And remember, Benjamin had been wiped out in the Old Testament. And so there wasn't many of them. I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. And that's culturally. But as for the law, I was a Pharisee. And we said that was the strictest sect of the religion. As to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. I went all the way. And then he lays this out at the end of verse 6. As to righteousness that was under the law, I was blameless. I was a perfect Jew. There's not anybody better than me. I had this pedigree that other people did not have, and as far as you could find it in the law, I was absolutely blameless. I did everything perfectly. Wow. I mean, that's a presumptuous statement, right? To say that about yourself, but I mean, it's true. And then what does he go on to say later in the chapter? Did all those things matter? No. They were garbage. They were dung. None of that mattered in comparison to Christ. So we just kind of listed some of these things. Do we have any questions about what any of these things that he lists means? Do we get them all? Any of them maybe unclear? So I know I just kind of went through them, but we didn't really talk about them. Andrew.
Knowing your tribe, and you mentioned the erasure of Benjamin, but also the captives destroyed most of the genealogical records. So
Yeah.
for a Jew to know his tribe lineage was also a rare thing.
It's a big deal.
And that was something that they would take immense pride in if they had the chance to know that.
Absolutely. And what was I about to say? I forgot. Brace, you've got your hand up?
And the Hebrew of Hebrews, I mean, it may be a cultural reference, could also be a linguistic reference. it was rare for an Israelite in the first century to be able to speak Hebrew.
That's true.
And we see evidence in the book of Acts at one point. Paul waves his hand and speaks in Hebrew, and the people are shocked. And it probably would have been only the most elite of the Jews who would have known that language. Most of them spoke Aramaic. They all spoke Greek. But very few of them spoke Hebrew. So he may be talking about the fact that my parents spoke Hebrew, and I spoke Hebrew, and I speak Hebrew. And so it's just another reference to how dedicated he is to the culture.
And part of that, I think, too, is connected with what Andrew was just saying. When they were taken into those foreign lands, they forgot Hebrew.
Right.
And so what happens when they come back into the land, the people don't speak the language that the scriptures are written in. And so then you start having these translations into Aramaic and things, because that Aramaic was what all of the people that captured them spoke. And so they lost their language, and so those that were able to still be able to speak the language of the oracles of God was a big deal. And Paul was one of those few people that could say that. Okay, so when we're summing all of this up, number one at the top of page 2, we're looking at what Paul says. So what does Paul say that he did against the church of God in these 3 passages that we looked at? I think maybe you could sum it up in one word, but what does he say he did against the church of God?
Persecuted.
He persecuted it. He says, I persecuted it. I went all the way. I was like your perfect picture of what an Israelite should be, right? I persecuted the church of God.
The NET,
Yeah.
Was it the Galatians quote? The NET uses the word, I savagely persecuted the church of God. And that was Paul choosing that word.
Yeah. I think the ESV had violently and yes, savagely. I mean, he gave it everything that he had. Again, because he thought that this was a heresy. This was about God's holiness, right? So he says that he persecuted the church and in this way, and he gives some indication to the extent of it. He doesn't really talk about the details in these letters. So I find it really interesting that Paul is pretty general about what he did. And then when we get to what others said about him and what they recorded, then we get a lot more of the details. And you start to see maybe why Paul didn't talk about a lot of these things. For one, I mean, maybe some of those that he was writing to, he had persecuted. There's that possibility. That those people that he was writing to, of course, after they had dispersed out of Judea and going back to some of their home regions, maybe they were receiving a letter from a guy who used to try to throw them in prison. So that would be a big thing. Also, I think about, we'll probably look at the stoning of Stephen. And who was there the whole time and in agreement with it and promoting the whole thing? It was Paul. Do you think he thought about that? Absolutely. So we see Paul's very general and he doesn't get into these details. And that says something, right? He says, yes, this is what I did. I don't want to ruminate on all of the nitty-gritty, and I don't want to, because when we talk about our past and how bad we used to be, right, and you can sort of relish in all of the things that you did. Oh, you don't understand. I was so bad. And we do that sometimes, but Paul, he did not want to do that. Did I see somebody else's hand up? Nope.
Yeah.
Oh, that was you. Yep.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
When you were saying that, how Paul maybe avoided the details, what popped into my mind was the description in the book of Hebrews of what the martyrs, the many various martyrs had suffered. I mean, to go as far as getting sawn in half and those kind of things where, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews necessarily, if it was Paul or not. But if that was going on contemporary to the people of that time, then that was on the menu in terms of what Paul may have known was going on.
Yeah. I don't think it was the Jews sawing people in two. That would have been very much against the law, but you never know, right? And their experiences that were happening and the fact that Paul at least implicitly is joining in with some of that and persecuting these people. So we've looked, it's very clear. Paul says from his own mouth, this is what I used to do. This is who I used to be. And then what's another way that we can corroborate who Paul was and what he did? Paul said it and other people said it. Okay, so obviously we're talking about the book of Acts. And so we have multiple records of Paul's previous life, the things that he did in fighting against the early church. And what's interesting about the book of Acts and who is writing it? Do we remember who's traditionally writing the book of Acts? It's never stated by name, right? But we believe it was Luke. Did Luke know Paul?
He was a friend of Paul's.
Yeah, he was a friend. And we have some of the indications. So, for example, let's turn to Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16. We're going to be at verse starting around 11. So this is one of those interesting passages in Acts where we see the pronouns switch here. Can I get somebody to read Acts 16 and do that paragraph 11 through 17? Somebody will do that. Acts 16, 11 through 17. Taylor, would you mind doing that?
Therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a colony. And we were staying in that city for some days. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made. And we sat down and spoke to the women who were there. And a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshipped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay with us." So she persuaded us. Now it happened as we went to prayer that a certain slave girl possessed with the spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune telling. This girl followed Paul and us, and cried out, saying, "These men are the servants of the Most High, who proclaim to us the way of salvation."
Okay, so what's interesting about this passage? We're not focusing on Philippi and Lydia, but we see this mention of we, right? Who does that include? I've seen two of the elders say it, but I know the rest of you know it too. To say we, who does that include? The person writing it, yeah, the author. I was there with Paul. I know him. And so part of the importance of, what we're looking at in Acts is this isn't just some record way down the line of people who heard something that heard something that heard something. The author was with Paul on these journeys and knew him personally and was a friend of his and was also a Gentile. Who would have thought that Saul of Tarsus would have been working with a Gentile in that way in one thing? Yeah, so we'll pick up on Wednesday with this idea of others reported it too, and the importance of Luke's testimony about what Paul did. And be prepared to get probably through the first half of page 3, so up to maybe what change occurred in Paul. Any questions before we end? No questions, Sheppy? No? Okay.